Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of Office Hours. Thanks for coming. So what is Office Hours? Well, if you haven't tuned in before, Office Hours is the show where in about an hour, I take 3 of your most pressing GM related questions and I answer them here live on the channel. So to get in on this action, if you want to submit your questions, we've got lots of great questions, but I want you to keep them coming. You can submit them at www.adam-koble.com/office-hours. There's a chat command in the Twitch chat, so you can use that as well. So today I've got 3 really great questions about some really specific stuff, which I think is super cool because if you know me, you know I like the specific questions. General questions are nice, but as we've talked about before, most general questions can be solved by talking to your players or playing the right game. Specific questions, now those are harder. That's what I like. And this first question particularly, it comes from Palimpsest Pulp, and it's a real kick in the butt. This is a good one because it obviously comes from someone who has listened to me talk about GMing before and is calling me on what they might potentially see as my GM bias. So check this out.
Given your opinion on how role-playing games should be made to do one thing very well, how do you reconcile that with the Powered by the Apocalypse series and your own dungeon world?
So damn, just coming right out of the gate with Palimpsest Pulp here, asking me about a seeming conflict between my agenda as a game master and designer and someone who made a game based on a different game. This is a really clever question, and I like it. It's good. Thank you, Palimpsest. So we got to talk about a couple of things first before we get into answering this question. So I want to talk about, first of all, that statement, my opinion that role-playing games should be made to do one thing very well. Now, that's not wrong. Palimpsest is spot on with this one. But let's talk about that a little bit. So in my mind, what makes a game good is that it does the things that it does mechanically in a way that is replicable from game to game and fulfills the promise that the game's presentation makes. So a game's art, a game's fiction, a game's rules should all work together to create a narrative experience at the table that coincides. So if the art portrays characters, flying and shooting lasers out of their eyes and, punching down buildings, but the rules are all about courtly drama, there's a dissonance there, and the game is failing. Now, when you start to pick games that try to do a lot of different things with one set of rules, you end up in this position where the game doesn't really do any of them very well. So this is why I don't like generic games, because generic games can only do one thing well, be generic. They can do generic things really well. So, for example, GURPS, great acronym. Terrible game. GURPS does one thing really well. It does kind of vaguely realistic feeling, kind of mathy anything. Everything that GURPS does feels like GURPS. So you might come into it saying, well, hey, I really want to play a game where we're all competitive parkourists, and I want this to be about the drama between us as we, compete for high parkourist, and it has to have rules for running and jumping, but also for like backstabbing and drama. Let's play GURPS. What's everybody's athletics score? How many perks and flaws do you have? You want to play a game about teenage mecha pilots in 20xdx fighting an alien race invading, Neo Japan. You play GURPS, it's going to feel the same as that parkour drama game, right? So the problem comes when people perceive games as being able to do anything. And They can't. Not well, anyway. So, in my opinion, the best role-playing games do specific things really well. They pick a thing. So they're like, we're going to be a game about pulpy adventure. And maybe that's, 1920s fighting mobsters pulp, or maybe it's, 60s two-fisted agents of America fighting the communist menace pulp, or maybe it's space adventure, but it's still the same thing. The setting is not the thing that makes the game feel that way. It's the rules. Like that game I was just describing, the pulp game, that's Fate, right? So Fate does that, right? Apocalypse World, some people perceive the Apocalypse engine the same way they perceive GURPS, which is a big old mistake because it's not the same thing. Now, the Apocalypse engine, I can point to, and I'm not gonna, this is one situation in which I'm not going to talk about what I like or what I dislike about certain Apocalypse engine based games, because, I made one, I'm a little too close to the subject material. I'll talk about games I do like, but I don't really want to throw around aspersions on my peers. Everybody, tries to make cool games using the tools that we have, and the Apocalypse engine's been really popular lately, so... I will talk about Dungeon World, though. I will definitely talk about Dungeon World. So, here's the thing, right? Apocalypse World came at game design from a funny perspective, because it was designed for an engine, for a mechanical engine, that was created as it was being built, right? Vincent Baker, its creator, Vincent has said that the game was created for... It was created for doing apocalypse games about community, and it was about interaction, and it was about certain desperations that get built into an apocalyptic setting. He started with the Angel. The Angel was the first part of the game, that playbook. And he built this game very specifically about the setting and about the substance of the game, but didn't design the mechanics first and then slap on a coat of apocalypse-colored paint, right? So what we're getting is not a generic game in the way Fate is generic, right? Look at the rule book for Fate. It encourages and tells you have to put your own stuff on top of this. Apocalypse World wouldn't allow us to do that unless we deconstruct it first, which is why I think it's a great game for basing your initial designs on, because if you're going to make something good out of it, you have to learn how to take it apart before you can put it back together. Because if you look at all the different Apocalypse engine games, first generation, second generation, third generation, whatever, you can't really pin down exactly what makes something powered by the Apocalypse game, right? It's not the 2d6 plus a modifier thing. It's not even necessarily the 6 fail, 7 to 9 cost, 10 plus succeed mechanic either, because Undying doesn't have that. It's not even necessarily the way the playbooks work, because the Warren doesn't do that. So it's not a generic system in the sense that Fate is. But what it does is they all tell stories that feel similar, right? Monster of the Week, Apocalypse World, Dungeon World, Saga of the Icelanders, they all feel to me very much like a similar type of game, in the same way that playing Fate is a bunch of different kinds of games that feel similar. So, let's talk about what the engine does. And I think this is useful as GM knowledge, because every really good GM is going to be able to look at a game and pick it apart and understand what it does and how it does that, so they can get the most mileage out of it. It's just like how I'm a terrible car owner because I don't know how my car works. I put gas in the back of it, and then I push the pedal and it goes, and then while it's going, I steer the wheel. That's about all I know about my car. Now, I could get a lot more out of my car if I knew how to fix it or tweak it, or if I could look at the engine and be like, oh, that's a spark plug, and that's a... I don't know any other car parts. That's the engine. Those are some tubes. I would be able to get more out of that car. So what I'm trying to teach you to do today, right now, is to get more out of the Apocalypse engine and the games that are based on it. And then hopefully you're going to be able to become more versed in that system, or whatever your own personal system is of choice is. So here's the thing. The Apocalypse engine has what I consider sort of three specific things that it does really well. Hard choices, first of all. So hard choices, if you know what I like about role-playing games, hard choices are my jam. Putting players in a position to say, do you want X or Y? X is good in this way, Y is good in this way. They both have things that they will get complicated by. They can give you, the games will say, you have 5 choices, pick 3 of them, right? Can't pick those other 2, right? All the Apocalypse games that I've played are about that. They're about making hard choices in the moment. They're also about snowballing action. Now, snowballing, which is to say, like, something starts off small and builds. And whether that's you make a move, you fail, your next move is harder, maybe you fail again, things get complicated, they build up and they build up until eventually you don't know what to do. You're dealing with this giant problem, which is fun. There's always because you want to give players things to butt up against. So the Apocalypse engine does that. It never lets up. Whether you're playing a very socially oriented dramatic game like Sagas, or you're playing basic dungeon bashing with Dungeon World, they both do the same thing. You're never going to really get that moment to rest unless you have intentionally, really dramatically earned it. The last thing that I think that the Apocalypse engine games do, and this is a thing that some people who are maybe misguided about the strengths of the Apocalypse system might leave out, rules and frameworks for GMing, and not just like you should maybe do this, not advice. I really don't like GM advice in rulebooks. Applied knowledge, sure. Procedure, sure. But rules in these games to say, when this happens, as the GM, this is what you do. And sometimes that means that the GM is making hard choices too, which encourages this idea of we're all playing together to find out why these things are happening the way that they do, to find out what it is that we're doing. So again, hard choices, snowballing action, frameworks for GMing, and that creates replicable play, right? This is why Apocalypse World was such a mind-blowing game for a lot of people, because the game that I play with Apocalypse World and the game that you play with Apocalypse World, whether we use a similar setting or a very different setting, they're going to feel the same because the rules drive us in that direction, and the GM framework teaches us whatever our personal GMing style is, these are the rules for us to play the game by. They keep us on point with the themes of the game. They push us in this direction of keeping momentum going. Which is what I think draws people, especially new designers and new GMs, into playing these games more often, right? So, going back to the question in the first place, the whole sort of purpose of all of this is, I think that Apocalypse World, it's like a filled-in character sheet, and we never really got to see the sheet itself. And people have tried. They've tried to design generic Apocalypse engine stuff, Avery made Simple World, I think, which is like a distillation of some of the core concepts, but I still think that misses the point in that it's not quite a thing you can play, because what's so great about the Apocalypse engine is that each iteration of it, each facet of that original thing that exists only in Vincent's head, and even then not independent of a setting, each individual thing is beamed through its own facet. We get its own aspect of those tools that Vincent originally created, which is why, for me, some of my favorite Apocalypse engine games are some of the later generation stuff, the stuff that is further from the original material. I love Sagas. Obviously, I have a love-hate relationship with Dungeon World. I love Apocalypse World, but stuff like the Warren or Night Witches, which I would consider sort of second or third generation Apocalypse World hacks, those start to do some really strange things. Undying, especially, start to do some really strange things. So that's my thought, right? Like, we're not looking at a kind of resurgence of the D20, like every setting has its own source book based on the same game mechanics, because that's very encouraging as a designer to know that people will buy your game because they already know how to play it, but you don't get good games that way. You get bad games. We're not looking at a Fate system either, because Fate is designed to tell pulp stories in any setting, and the setting doesn't really matter. What I think the deal is here is that each good Apocalypse Engine game takes what Vincent created, strips it down, and rebuilds it as something new that's still very much about one thing. It's about dungeons, it's about hunting monsters, it's about surviving in a post-apocalyptic community. In a way, Apocalypse World is an Apocalypse World hack. We're all building on these invisible tools that don't really exist. And so that's how we end up with all of these different iterations. And honestly, I think that the era of the Apocalypse Engine is maybe starting to come to a close. If not a complete close, but we're starting to move away from it, because design trends, they happen in game design, and Apocalypse World's been around for a while, and so we're going to start seeing more games built on other things, built in different ways. This sort of last generation of Apocalypse World games are going to be starting to deviate so far that we're going to end up with some very different things. And plus, there's other systems that are coming out, like Blades, that are creating a similar thing. Blades is a lot more explicit about what it is and how it wants you to build alternate settings, modifying the poetry layer. And if you want to know more about that, you can watch the video that John and I did just about how to hack Blades, so you can check that out. Again, I bring all of this stuff up. I bring it up because I think that when it comes down to it, every good game master is a game designer to some degree. I think, you're all, as soon as you start to think about how the rules work, and as soon as you want to start to change the game you're already playing, I think you're becoming a game designer already. Congratulations. Let's give a listen to our next question. So, continuing on the theme of apocalypse related stuff, I wanted to take a very specific GMing question for those games.
Hey Adam, I'm having trouble figuring out the GM turn for Dungeon World, adventure fronts versus campaign fronts. I received a lot of really good ideas from my players and need to sort them out into adventures rather than just having a metric fuck ton of campaign fronts. Let me know.
So bonus points for Ink Art Nerd for using the phrase metric fuck ton. That's nice. I think that might be why I picked this question for this week. So Ink Art Nerd wants to know how to create and manage fronts in Dungeon World. I won't go too much into detail because, I think the work is there in the book. But I do want to talk a little bit about like GMing organizational tools and how I wish more games had them. So, for example, Apocalypse World, which inspired Dungeon World's front system, Apocalypse World organizes fronts in terms of the kinds of threats they represent in the world. So if you want to have a gang of mutants that represent hunger, you want to have a wasting disease that represents despair, you want to hear about, the collapse of society because of disease. All of those things get built around the characters, and the characters struggle against them. They're called fronts because it's a war, right? It's a war on all fronts. In Dungeon World, the way that we redesigned those fronts, they're still pretty similar. They still hew quite close to Vincent's model. But in Dungeon World, the fronts are organized much more traditionally along D&D lines. So in a D&D game, and this is coming almost purely from my personal experience as a game master, but let's talk about how a D&D game is ostensibly structured in a sort of classic advanced Dungeons & Dragons sense. So you've got your campaign, and the campaign is about something. And you've got adventures. And adventures are like seasons of the campaign. They're multiple sessions that run together in some thematically connected way that ties to the campaign. And so what we did in Dungeon World was create that sort of front triangle, that front pyramid, by saying your campaign front consists of unsorted or overarching significant stuff for the whole campaign. Your adventure fronts are things that are happening concurrently throughout the campaign as the players move through it. Now, you can fronts are maybe the thing that's easiest to cut directly out of Dungeon World and use to organize other games. If you're playing AD&D, you can say my campaign. Let's use a real example. I'm tempted to take it to the shelf, but I won't. Okay, so let's look at AD&D. Now, classic AD&D had a series of adventures. They had an arc, and this is gonna age me, but that's fine. So they had an arc of adventures that started with the slavers modules. There's 4 modules. You would fight some slavers. So you discover that there's slavers, then you fight them some more, then you go to their base and you fight them. Then you realize that the slavers are connected to another set of adventures, and so I can never remember if the slavers are connected to the Underdark ones, but basically there's some giants, there's some adventures about drow, and they're all fundamentally about the reincarnation or the ascendance of some dark demon entity, Maglubiet or something. But the point was that you were supposed to run these adventures in a chronological way. You were supposed to run, A1, A2, A3, then go on to D1, D2, D3, then go to the last adventure. And you could mix and match them. You could insert other adventures, and that's it. But it was all about the same thing. So what we did in Dungeon World to split this up, and this is how I create my campaigns in Dungeon World, is that the campaign front, let's do one. Let's make one up now. Okay, so there's a campaign. You want to run a campaign, and you're really into liches. So you got a thing for liches. So let's say you got a thing for liches, and you're like, I want this to be about the ascendance of Vecna. Yeah, Vecna's King Lich. He's the best. We're going to use him. And so you have Vecna, and you have Vecna he's sleeping, and he's kind of building a cult with his sleeping whispers, and his cult wants to bring him back to life. So your adventure fronts are the various things that either interact directly with the campaign front or work against it. So you can have an orc tribe that is marauding in the kingdom. Now, they might be connected. You might say, okay, the orc tribe could come across, Vecna's forgotten shin bone and then make a club out of it, and the orc chieftain could get the shin of Vecna and become all-powerful. You could have the cult as a campaign front. So even if the cult is destroyed, Vecna is still around and has influence. You could have a tribe of giants that live nearby. You could have a village that's being poisoned by a corrupt elemental. You have all the other cool stuff that you want to do in the campaign, but they're all separated into blobs. And whatever the players interact with, those ones, they go through the different steps of the front. So they're going to try, they think the orcs are the most present danger. They're going to go after the orcs. Maybe they're going to try to burn down a nearby orc encampment. If that succeeds, that sets that campaign or that adventure front back, and eventually it may not matter. But if they choose to focus on another front, then the orc adventure front will carry on, it'll build, and eventually you'll get to a point where the chieftain has the shin bone of Vecna, and that's one check on the campaign front, the awakening of Vecna. Now, you have to be a little bit more flexible when doing fronts, because unlike a campaign in traditional D&D sense, your adventure will change based on what the players do. And now, if you want a good example of this, if you want to look at a game that gives some really great advice about creating a world that's in motion, go look at Dogs in the Vineyard. Look at the GMing advice in Dogs in the Vineyard, because the stuff in there is really important for figuring out how to do a world that the PCs matter in. And I'll explain why in a little bit more detail, I think, in later episodes. There's some questions about this. But the key point is, think about what would happen in a world where the PCs never existed. What would happen, right? If the PCs never showed up to fight the orcs, well, what would happen? They would find the shin bone, and that would affect the campaign arc. Think about every time you make a front, Think about how does this front affect my larger idea of the campaign? But be flexible. Let the players destroy your fronts. Let them get in there, cause trouble, because that's what players do, and that's what makes Dungeon World satisfying for the players, impacting the world. Creating and managing fronts. It's tricky. It's really tricky. But it's an idea for creating both the room to have these sort of linear blocks of content, like dungeons. A dungeon can be an adventure front. But it's also a way to blur those lines between the two and have them all thematically tied together into one overarching thing. And when I say, build the fronts, and we talk about building the campaign and we're doing all that stuff, it's not about doing it in advance, right? It's about leaving gaps to fill in as you go. And this can be as broad as, I'm not sure what the campaign front is yet. I don't really have an idea. We'll start with this one adventure and then we'll go from there. Down all the way to a granular level of not knowing what the next step towards the resolution of a front is. You don't have to have these all prepped in advance. So specific stuff about Dungeon World, but there's lots of games that have codified GM preparation stuff. And honestly, it's becoming more and more something that I look for first when I pick up a role-playing game. When I get a PDF from a Kickstarter, or I go to a game store, though that hasn't happened in a long time, I'll pop open my book, pop open my PDF, flip through, and go to the GM section. And if it's just an entire chapter about things I could do or story ideas, my hype level immediately descends slightly. If I rated games, if I rated role-playing games, if I did reviews, I would definitely take a star off for having bad or no GMing framework, especially for in-between session stuff. This is why Stars Without Number is my favorite OSR game, because it has that. So look at your games. Go reread those terrible GM sections. If it's all about like the golden rule and nudging you and giving you advice and saying, you're the GM, you know best, then maybe consider finding a different game or steal a prep section from a different game. So there you go. That's my thoughts about creating and managing fronts effectively. Fronts, just as an aside, as a quick aside, fronts are something that I would love to go back in time and clear up a little, give better examples. I think they're still too close to the Apocalypse World fronts. I would do some different things with them, but I'm not entirely certain what at this point. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe you have ideas. Leave me some comments. How would you improve fronts in Dungeon World or Apocalypse World? I'm curious to know. So our third question comes from a familiar voice to me. I want to hear what Sileo Neko has to ask.
Hello, Adam. I'm Dave. I go by Sileo Neko on Twitch. We're running a game right now of Shadowrun, and the GM wants to take a break, get a chance to play, but we don't want everyone to have to go through the process of building new characters. So the current plan is for me to take over after the next mission or so, to give him a break, a chance to play, and maybe continue that process of every couple of sessions or missions, switching up to a new person so everyone gets a chance to play and to see the GM side of things. Have you seen that work in the past or not work, and what sort of things should we be on the lookout for to make it work better? Thanks.
That is a great question, and something that I think comes up a lot for folks, because, GMing can cause fatigue. It can be a thing that you get tired of doing, and sometimes you want to see a game from a different angle, but you don't want to lose the game's architecture altogether. Reasons why you might want to rotate GMs: burnout, GM is leaving, you don't want to abandon the campaign. Somebody wants to try playing, somebody wants to get their first chance in GMing. The world can be big enough for these things, but there are reasons to not do this. There's definitely reasons not to, and there are reasons to do it carefully, to tread carefully in this space. So Celio Neko's question here is about specifically a Shadowrun campaign. So we'll try to use that as an example. A Shadowrun campaign in which they didn't want to make new characters because Jesus God, making characters in Shadowrun is it's heavy. It's hard work. So that makes sense. And I think that Shadowrun is modular enough that you're going to have some success. And we'll talk about specifically how you can get success there. But Shadowrun is built on, and we're talking about Shadowrun here, not Mirror Shades. So Shadowrun as written is built on the idea that the characters are undergoing missions, right? So they do a mission, then they stop. Then they get another mission, they do it, they stop. They get another mission, they do it, they stop. The missions might be connected, adventure fronts, campaign front. They might be connected by we work for the same mega corporation, or we're constantly fighting the same mega corporation, or we find out that Mr. Johnson has been the Great Dragon Loftweir all along. So we're really like working for Loftweir. There are ways to trend those things together, but there's also ways to separate them, right? To break that out. So you've got an easy game here to do this with, because all you have to do is say, okay, everyone has a Shadowrunner. Whoever's GMing doesn't play their Shadowrunner and they present the mission. You will lose some of the cohesion of the campaign, but if you want to do it episodically, if you want to do it like, we're just going to sit down and Shadowrun, you're done. You're good. Good to go. Have your GM make a character, have whoever's going to GM set their character aside. They go on hiatus. They go to Tahiti to spend some of their money. They lay on a beach sipping soy mimosas. Ew. And in the meantime, somebody else is the GM. You switch them around. It's easy, right? Just play. But what often happens in campaign play is creative direction. Right? Now, if you watched me play Darkest Dungeon at all, especially the last session that I played of it, or most recent, you'll know that creative direction is a thing that just as much in video games is important in a role-playing game at the table. This is what the GM does in a lot of ways. And when creative direction comes up against metagaming, it comes up against twinkism. We'll talk about that in a second. When it comes up against disagreeing thematic goals for the game, you can really get into some frustrating situations, right? Because let's imagine Stephen is running the West Marches. Stephen Lumpkin running the West Marches. In case you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube years later and you never heard of the West Marches, God knows why. It's beautiful. So let's imagine that Stephen is running the West Marches, and God forbid Stephen has to step down as the GM for the West Marches, and he asks somebody else to run it for him. Let's say that somebody is, I don't know. We'll not pick a particular person, but let's say somebody else is running it, and Stephen steps down, and this person runs the West Marches, but they're like a totally different person about GMing. They're like, okay, well, you know, the horror stuff and the creepiness or whatever, that's fine, but this is Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm gonna put you in a dungeon, and we're gonna make you fight dragons. And there's traps, and you're gonna have to like check every 5 feet for traps, and there's gonna be like really intense rules stuff happening, and we're gonna throw out all of those house rules that Stephen had. It's not the same game anymore because that creative direction has changed, right? In that Stephen has an idea for how the West Marches should run, and this other person might have another reason to be playing the game. They might have a different agenda. Now, because Dungeons and Dragons doesn't offer any kind of formula or structure for GMing, you have nothing to impart the information from one person to another. Right? Creative direction is important in a campaign because generally having, and this is kind of an authoritative statement that feels weird out of context, but in a role-playing game or really any artistic thing, somebody chooses the direction of the world at large. Somebody has that push of where the game goes. Right? So losing that between GMs can be very tricky, especially if somebody has a really strong idea about something different in the game. So I guess to be careful of that, to avoid that, you want to just have everybody talk about thematic stuff that is relevant to your game, especially if you're the GM and you're giving up your GMing position temporarily. Because hopefully you either want them to carry on or you want it to be modular enough that they can say, okay, for my turn, it's going to be weird. Think about it as different people directing movies in the same universe. The characters are the same. Harry Potter is Harry Potter in every one of the Harry Potter movies. Played by the same actor, played more or less the same way, directed a little bit differently. But the movies feel tonally a little bit different from movie to movie with different directors. So it's important to talk about that. It's important to have the whole group as as sort of a production team to talk about how they want the game to feel, so you don't lose that. Also, let the game dictate to you with their rules, right? Let the rules, play by the rules. If you make hacks, you've already hopefully gotten everyone to agree with them. Don't change the rules between GMs. So creative direction is one thing that you need to be careful of. Another thing that you might want to look out for is campaign direction, because if you're playing a very strict campaign, again, Shadowrun, you shouldn't have this problem. But if I gave up control of, let's say, Burning Wheel, the game that I'm running right now, if I gave that over to another player, the problem might be that they have different ideas about what they want to see, and we might get dragged off into a different direction. Now, you can do that by playing in the same setting with the same rules, but with all different characters. But you've already said you don't want to do that. So talk about it first, right? There's a direction the game is going. And remember that nobody controls the game. Nobody, if you're switching GMs, authority is going to transfer to them, and you have to be willing to say, okay, I give my game to you. I give all the work that I've done to you. On a game level, and hopefully this is a thing that's solved by just being decent gamers and not being shitty players. Hopefully you can avoid the problems of metagame information. So the one thing that the GM often gets, one bonus that we have as GMs, is we have all the secrets. So if, for example, that I knew something special as the GM, something special about the campaign, and I turn it over to another GM, am I required to tell them the big secrets? In which case, when they return to being players, they're not secrets anymore. So either play a game where secret stuff doesn't really matter, and you're just looking at it on a very narrow scale. What happens today is important. Don't think about the game that way. Otherwise, you're going to run into having to pass that knowledge around, which can lead to something that I think some groups have a problem with. I try to avoid it, but metagaming. So, metagaming is one of these things where people both, I think, get crucified for it. The perception that someone is metagaming, that they're using outside information in the game, they get crucified for it much too easily. But I think that in-game secret stuff can be tricky. So be wary of that. If you're running a secrets-heavy game, like campaign-level secrets, it might not be appropriate for you. And then lastly, and this is I'm doing these in order of most likely to be a problem to least likely. Least likely is the GMPC situation, the kind of shitty player being okay. So there's a lot of definitions for the word twink. Some of them I know but in role-playing games, it's a kind of an old term. Someone who's a twink is it's another name for min-maxing, but with an especially intentional goal of making your character crappy in every way except for one, and having some unfair advantage as a result. So look out for that if you're playing with people who are very, very game focused, or you're playing a very heavy game type of game. Min-maxing when you used to be the GM can be a huge problem, because the GM could say, I don't know, there's World of Warcraft is the same thing. The World of Warcraft analogy is a really good one. Yeah, level 19 hunter with a full suit of blues. So here's the thing. So the GM turns over authority, becomes a player. The other GM says, okay, at the end of the adventure, there's you've killed all these monsters, there's all this treasure, and they write in their notebook secret chamber the players never found. turns over the information, goes back to playing their character, and they're like, oh, we should go back to that dungeon. I bet you there's a secret y'all missed. Go back, gather up all your shit, and away you go. Right? It's cheating. It's stupid cheating, and if you're playing with people who do that, fuck them. Or don't. Disregard them. They're awful. This is just avoided by not playing with crappy losers. The other thing that you can do to sort of prep yourself for this is play games that have it built in. Now, it was mentioned in chat that Night Witches does have a mechanism for this. I want to talk a little bit about it because I don't like it. And I'll explain why. So, in Night Witches, when you get to a certain point in the game, you are able to switch the role of GM. So as a player, you can activate a mechanical thing that lets you become the GM on the next session. So you kind of end the current mission and you take over as GM. Which, okay, I don't like that it crosses the mechanical boundary, right? Where something your player does, or something your character does, changes the GM role. That feels a little weird to me. It's also very fuck you, this is over, where I'm GMing now, which feels kind of strange to me. It also, the game doesn't support it. The game doesn't talk very much about any of the stuff we were talking about here, like how to avoid common pitfalls of changing the GMing around. It does thankfully have a very solid, again, to go back to the first question, built on the powered by the apocalypse stuff. It has this very solid GMing structure. But it doesn't really do anything to help you avoid the pitfall of creative direction. It doesn't give you mechanisms for dealing with that stuff. So it does feel a little bit like, I don't know, it feels a little like perfunctory in that game. I expected it to be better when I heard that it was going to be, not Night Witches. Night Witches is a great game, but I've never used the time to switch mechanism before. We've switched between duty stations, but I've never done the I get an in-game moment that lets me change on the next session. But that's just me, right? Maybe playing that game will be of value to you. And there's lots and lots of other games that do multiple GMs really well. I don't want to go into like talking about them too much right now, but Fiasco, Microscope, those are the common two. I don't like Polaris at all, but maybe you will. It's not the game for me. And honestly, if you want to test somebody out, or if somebody wants to test being the GM, take a moment, take a session, take 2 sessions, and just play a different game. There's lots of games that do well in a 1-shot or a 2-shot. So if somebody wants to try being a GM and you're afraid it's going to derail your campaign, I mean, don't do it, right? Play something else. Yeah, so there's lots of little things that can hit a snag, but really, if you sit down and say, if you're the GM or the 2 GMs sit down and talk about it, and just say, these are the things this is where the campaign is going. These are the things that I'm going to keep a secret. Don't, go into these places in the campaign. You can maintain cohesion, but remember, doing this, rotating a GM and maintaining the same universe and players is a hack. You're hacking the game. You've cut the warranty sticker, and you're inside the game in a way that you weren't designed to be, unless you're playing a game that has rules for it and supports it in a specific way. I hope that, I wish you luck. I hope that you have a good time with it, and I hope that whoever is your GM for Shadowrun, whatever version it is, I hope they get a break and get to goof around with the slightly less complicated version of the rules for a little while. It can be tricky territory, but I believe in you, and hopefully I've helped move you towards a place where you feel a little more confident doing that. So that's it for today's office hours. We covered a couple of topics. This is maybe the most specific one we've done so far, and hopefully it's got your brain thinking about Apocalypse Engine, what that might mean, things you can do to rotate GMs, and how to create effective prep. I hope that if you like the show, you'll keep tuning in. This has been Office Hours, episode number 4. And as always, if you want to participate, you can get involved by going to www.adam-kobold.com/office-hours or hitting up the office hours command in the chat. So go and do that. Give me your questions, and we will see you next Monday at 2 o'clock for more live office hours. Have a good one, everybody.